The sun would rise early in Bakersfield, California, casting a golden hue over the cotton fields that stretched for miles beyond our little wooden house. I can still smell the earth, warm and rich, with the scent of freshly tilled soil that would carry on the breeze. My name is Martha Wilson, and I was born in 1947 in a small town where life was simple and full of love, though it was far from easy. We didn't have much in material possessions, but my parents, George and Ella Lehner, made sure we had what mattered most, each other. So if you're watching, baby, go ahead and like this video, comment where in the world you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss tomorrow's true story. 'Cause this ain't just my story, it's the story of too many women who had to smile through the silence. My father worked the fields as a cotton picker. His hands, though calloused and rough from the years of hard labor, were gentle when they touched our faces. He had the kind of strength that came from working with the earth, and even though he never said much, his quiet wisdom was the foundation of our family. My mother, Ella Lehner, took care of the house with an unwavering dedication. She cooked our meals over the wood stove in the living room, and I often found her hands weaving through the threads of life, whether it was mending our clothes or telling us stories about the family's past. Together, they made sure that, even with very little, we were all taken care of. I was the third of 5 children. Robert and Mary, my older siblings, were always the responsible ones, taking on extra chores around the house and looking out for me. Jane and Thomas, the younger ones, still needed a lot of attention and care. I always liked being in the middle of it all, part of the older group, but still with the freedom to play and run barefoot through the cotton fields. It was a childhood full of simple joys. The laughter of my siblings, the crackle of the fire in the stove, the taste of fresh bread my mother would bake. My heart still aches when I think of the little things, how my father would whistle as he worked the fields, or how my mother's arms would hold us close before bed. Our home was small but cozy. We lived in a house with only 3 rooms, a living room that doubled as the kitchen, where we ate our meals and gathered as a family, and 2 bedrooms. The floors were covered with simple rugs, and there were always small touches of warmth throughout, like the picture of Jesus that hung on the wall and the black and white photograph of my parents on their wedding day. There was love in that house, even if there was barely enough food to go around some days. The mornings were early in our house. My father would rise before the sun, the smell of strong coffee filling the air as my mother prepared breakfast. We children would follow shortly after. I can still remember the smell of cornmeal mush with milk from Mr. Peterson's cow, our neighbor, that we would eat before heading out to do our chores. The work started early, each of us had our assigned tasks. Mine was sweeping the yard, collecting eggs from the chickens, and helping to hang the laundry. The chickens were my favorite. I would sneak an extra egg when I thought no one was looking and bring it into the house with a secret smile on my face. Our yard was vast, and I always loved the feeling of the wind blowing through the cotton plants and the trees my father had planted, the peach, apple, and lemon trees that were so symbolic of our family. School was a long walk away. Oakdale Elementary, almost an hour's journey on foot, sat at the end of a dirt road that cut through the cotton fields. In the heat of summer, the dust would coat our shoes and make our feet heavy, but we didn't mind. The walk gave us plenty of time to talk, to sing the songs my grandmother Theodora had taught me, and to imagine the lives of the people who lived in the small houses we passed. In the rain, we would arrive at school with our feet wet, but no matter the weather, it was always an adventure. I loved school. My favorite teacher was Mrs. Baker, an older woman with gray hair pulled up in a tight bun. She had the patience of a saint and saw something in me that no one else had noticed. She taught me how to read, and it was as though a door had opened into a new world. I remember sitting with my mother in the evenings after school, reading out loud to her as she sewed or stirred dinner on the stove. Books became my escape, my window to worlds far beyond our small farm. Though we didn't have many books at home, just an old Bible and some almanacs my father brought from town, those few pages became my greatest treasure. We didn't have toys like the other kids. We made our own dolls from corn husks, kites from bamboo sticks and old tissue paper, balls made from socks filled with rags. My siblings and I were creative with whatever we had. The boys would make their own games with old scraps, and we would run through the fields, laughing and racing each other, pretending to be the heroes in the stories we created. Weekends were spent at the creek, which ran near our home. The water was cool and clear, and we would catch small fish, take baths on hot summer afternoons, and laugh at the sound of our voices echoing through the trees. The food was simple but filling. Breakfast was usually cornmeal mush, cornbread baked by my mother once a week, and a bit of milk from Peterson's cow. Lunch was beans, rice, and vegetables from the garden, and on good days, a piece of meat or a fried egg. Dinner was often potato soup, made with dried meat or leftovers from lunch. The food we ate was what the land gave us, nothing fancy, but always enough to fill our bellies. The 4th of July was a special time. Our town would come together for parades and fireworks, and my mother would make corn pudding, corn on the cob, and cornbread. We would sit in the town square, watching the fireworks light up the sky, and for those few moments, life felt magical. But even as a child, I began to sense that things were changing. It was around that time, when I was about 10 years old, that I started to notice the worry on my parents' faces. The cotton wasn't bringing in the money it once had. I would hear them talking late at night, voices hushed in the kitchen, and I could sense their unease. I didn't fully understand it then, but I could feel the weight of the world bearing down on them. In 1958, when I was 11, the news came that would change our lives. My father's uncle, who lived in Springfield, Missouri, offered my father a job at a textile factory that was expanding. It was a steady job with a regular paycheck, something that the cotton fields could no longer guarantee. My mother, though hesitant, agreed to the move after many long discussions. And so, our family packed up and said goodbye to Bakersfield, the town where we had always lived, where our roots were deep. I still remember that day, the day we left. It was a Sunday morning, and the truck that would carry our few belongings was already loaded. My father said his goodbyes to the neighbors, hugging them tightly, and my mother took one last look at the lemon tree in the yard before we drove away. The air was thick with the weight of that goodbye, and we children, teary-eyed, said farewell to Spot, our dog, who would stay behind with Mr. Peterson's family. As we drove away from Bakersfield, the world felt both heavy and hopeful. We didn't know what the future held, but we left with the belief that things would be better, that the move to Springfield would bring new opportunities. It would be a long time before I understood just how much that decision would change all of us, especially me. The journey from Bakersfield to Springfield was long, stretching over the course of several days, but there was an undeniable sense of anticipation in the air. The decision had been made, and though my mother wept quietly as we left behind the town we had always known, there was also a glimmer of hope in her eyes. We were leaving the cotton fields behind, the farm that had sustained us for years, but was now failing us. We didn't know what awaited us in Springfield, but we knew we had no choice. It was a leap into the unknown. I remember the first day we arrived. Springfield was unlike anything I had ever seen. The streets were wider, the buildings taller, and the air smelled of something other than earth and cotton, of city life, of opportunity, and yet, there was something foreign about it. We were strangers here, the new family from California, and for a long time, I felt out of place. But my parents were determined, and as they unloaded the few belongings we had into the modest home we rented, their determination shone through. My father, who had spent his entire life working the fields, now worked at a textile factory, a steady job with a regular paycheck. It was a fresh start, even if it felt a little too foreign. The house we rented was small, nothing like the big house in Bakersfield, but bigger than the tiny wooden shack we had left behind. It had 4 rooms, a modest yard, and a garden that my mother immediately began to plant with herbs and vegetables. It was a humble beginning in a new city, but my parents didn't mind. They were used to making do with what they had. My father worked tirelessly at the factory, while my mother took care of the home and the 5 of us. I started school at Springfield High, feeling like a fish out of water. The kids at the new school were different, more confident, less polite, and they made fun of us. They called us the Hicks from California, and I hated that. I didn't understand it at the time, but looking back, I can see that we were an oddity. We didn't speak the way they did, and we didn't have the same lifestyle. But we didn't let it discourage us. Slowly, we found our place. My siblings and I stuck together, helping each other navigate this strange new world. I'll never forget meeting Robert Miller. I was just a teenager, 15 years old, when he walked into the small clothing store where I worked. He was tall, with a friendly smile and an easygoing manner. I had seen him around town before. He worked for his father, who owned the local grocery store. But it wasn't until that day in the shop that we really spoke. I was helping a customer when he approached me, and we exchanged a few words about the weather, about the town, about life. It was nothing special, just small talk, but there was something about him that caught my attention. Robert was 5 years older than me, and though he had a lot more experience in the world than I did, there was something kind and open in his eyes that made me feel comfortable. We started talking more and more, and soon enough, he began to walk me home after work. The walks were long and full of conversation, and I found myself looking forward to them every day. He was different from anyone I had ever met, a breath of fresh air in this strange new town. We dated for 3 years before we decided to marry. It wasn't a grand affair. There were no big celebrations, no elaborate dresses or extravagant parties, but it was ours. We were married in 1966 at the First Baptist Church in Springfield, and the ceremony was simple, just a small gathering of family and friends. After the wedding, we lived in a room at the back of Robert's family's grocery store while we saved money for our own place. It wasn't glamorous, but we were happy. Robert worked with his father at the store, and I continued working at the clothing shop. In 1967, David was born. I still remember the moment I held him for the first time, feeling his tiny body in my arms. There is nothing in this world that can prepare you for the overwhelming love you feel for your child. I looked at him, and I knew right then and there that my life had changed forever. 2 years later, Linda came along, completing our family. Life seemed perfect. Robert and I worked hard, raised our children, and spent weekends visiting my parents, who still lived in Springfield's North Side. By 1972, we had saved enough money to buy our own house in the Woodland Heights neighborhood. It wasn't a grand house, but it was ours, and that was all that mattered. It had a small yard, just enough space for the children to run around in, and my mother's garden began to take shape there, too. Robert's grocery store grew, and I left my job at the clothing shop to help him with the business. We were building something together, our own little empire, made of sweat and love. The years went by in what seemed like a blur. David and Linda grew up so quickly, and they started to make their own marks on the world. David, who had always been interested in business, began to work alongside Robert at the store. He had big dreams, talking about expanding the small grocery store into something much larger. Linda, on the other hand, was always more studious. She graduated from Springfield State College as a teacher, and soon after, she married Jerome, a man who worked at a local bank. It was around this time that the signs of change started to show. I can't say exactly when it happened, but it was in the late 1970s when things began to shift. The pressures of life, of raising two children and working to support them, started to wear on Robert and me. The business, though successful, was never easy. We worked hard, but it seemed like we were always just getting by. The children were growing older, and with their independence came new challenges. But we were a family, and I believed that no matter what came our way, we could face it together. Then, in 1990, Linda married Jerome and moved to St. Louis. The house was quieter after that, and I felt a pang of sadness as my daughter started her new life. But I was happy for her. She was becoming the woman I had always hoped she would be, independent, strong, and with a heart full of love. When she visited, she would bring my grandchildren, Sarah and Michael, and I would delight in their laughter and energy. Those visits were always the highlight of my week. Life continues to move forward as it does. The years passed, and Robert and I grew older. Our bodies began to feel the strain of all those years of hard work. But we had each other, and that was enough. We had built a life that was far from perfect, but one that was rich in love and family. Our children were doing well, and the business was growing. We were living the American dream. But in 2005, just when everything seemed stable, life threw us a curveball that would change everything. Life in Springfield began to take on a steady rhythm. After our move from Bakersfield, Robert and I slowly adjusted to the demands of city life. The transition wasn't always easy, but we found a sense of belonging in this bustling, growing town. As the years passed, our love for each other deepened, and together, we built something more than just a home. We built a family and a future. When Robert and I first married, our life was modest, but there was a quiet pride in the way we worked side by side. The grocery store, which was originally Robert's father's, was our little piece of the world. We didn't have a lot, but we had enough. Enough to get by, enough to dream of more, and most importantly, enough to be content. Robert worked tirelessly, managing the store, ordering goods, overseeing the finances, and ensuring that everything ran smoothly. His determination was admirable, and I admired him more than I could ever express. He didn't complain about the long hours, and neither did I. At the time, I had my own job at a small clothing shop, and though it wasn't much, it kept me busy. It allowed me to contribute to the household, even if only in a small way. When we weren't working, we were raising our two children, David and Linda. They were our joy, our reason for everything we did. It wasn't easy, but we made it work. We didn't have the luxury of weekends off or grand vacations, but we had each other. We were a family, and that was enough. The birth of David in 1967 brought a flood of emotions I hadn't known I could feel. I had been nervous, of course, but the moment I held him in my arms, all my fears melted away. The love I felt for that tiny baby was overwhelming. I remember his small hands, his innocent eyes, and how his soft cooing filled our small home with warmth. He was our first child, and Robert and I were both utterly enchanted by him. Life changed in ways I hadn't expected. Suddenly, every decision we made was for him. Everything we did, from the food we ate to the choices we made about where we would live, was for his future. 2 years later, Linda arrived, bringing with her the sweetness and gentleness that only a daughter could. She was the quiet one, so unlike her older brother, who was boisterous and full of energy. Linda's calm presence balanced out David's exuberance, and together, they made us so proud. I spent my days caring for them, teaching them what little I knew, and making sure they had everything they needed. Robert and I were a team, each of us contributing to their upbringing in our own way. As the years went on, we began to dream bigger dreams. The grocery store grew in popularity, and Robert worked harder than ever to expand it. It was a small store, but it had everything our community needed: fresh produce, meats, dairy, canned goods, and the occasional treat. Robert had a vision for it, though, a vision that stretched beyond the confines of its tiny walls. He wanted to expand, to make it something bigger, something that could provide more for our family. I supported him wholeheartedly. I was his biggest cheerleader, always encouraging him to follow his dreams. In 1972, after years of hard work, we bought our own house in the Woodland Heights neighborhood. It was a modest home, small but comfortable. It was just the right size for our growing family. My mother helped me plant a garden, just like the one she had started back in Bakersfield. The yard was big enough for David and Linda to run around in, and I spent hours in that garden, watching the flowers bloom and the vegetables grow. There was something about tending to that garden that brought me peace, something about it that reminded me of the simple life we had left behind in California. Robert took over the grocery store after his father passed away in 1975. It was a big responsibility, but Robert never balked at it. He worked long hours, pouring himself into the business, and I was right there beside him, doing what I could to help. We hired a few people to help with the store, and I started to take on a larger role in managing things at home. The children were getting older, and it was important for them to understand the value of hard work. David began helping his father at the store, learning the ropes and dreaming about one day making it bigger. He had ambition, that boy. From a young age, he showed an interest in business, and I could see that he wanted more than just the small grocery store. He wanted to build something of his own, something great. Linda, on the other hand, was quieter. She loved books and learning, and she was always focused on her studies. I was so proud of her when she graduated from Springfield State College in 1987 and became a teacher. It was everything I had hoped for her: a stable career, a life she could be proud of. But even though she had her own life, she never failed to visit, bringing my grandchildren, Sarah and Michael, with her. Her visits were always a bright spot in our lives. Robert and I, though tired from years of hard work, never stopped loving the life we had built. We had come a long way from the small wooden house in Bakersfield, and it was a life I cherished. Still, things were not without their challenges. The grocery store, though successful, was not an easy business. There were always the financial pressures: suppliers to pay, inventory to manage, bills to settle. Robert's dream of expanding the store was a good one, but it came with its own set of risks. We didn't have much, but we did our best to stretch what we had and make sure the bills were paid. The store, while small, became a cornerstone of the community, and Robert was known for his honesty and hard work. He was respected by everyone, and I took pride in being his partner in all things. Despite the challenges, our family continued to grow. David and Linda were no longer children. They were adults with lives of their own. They had their own dreams, their own paths to follow. But the bond we shared remained strong. Robert and I tried to raise them the best we could, teaching them about hard work, family, and the value of integrity. As they grew older, they began to form their own opinions about the world, and though their paths were different, we hoped they would continue to carry the lessons we had taught them with them. Then came 1990. Linda married Jerome, a kind man she met while teaching, and moved to St. Louis. It was a bittersweet moment for me. I was so happy for her, but it hurt to see her go. The house felt emptier without her, and Robert and I were left with an undeniable sense of loss. We were still so proud of her, of course, but a piece of our family had moved away, and the quiet of our home seemed louder than ever before. Even though David was still living with us, there was a shift in the family dynamic. He had grown into a young man full of ambition, and his desire to help expand the store only grew stronger. His mind was always on business, on how we could take the grocery store to the next level. Robert and I were getting older, and there was a sense that we had done all we could for the store. It was time for David to take charge, to make his mark on the world. But little did I know, things were about to take a darker turn. For now, though, life went on. Robert continued to work at the store, and I continued to take care of our home, our family, and everything in between. We had made a life together, a life that was built on hard work, sacrifice, and love. And yet, deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slowly changing, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. But I wasn't ready to face it just yet. It would come soon enough, and when it did, it would change everything. It was a Sunday afternoon, one of those rare, peaceful moments when everything seemed to be in its right place. Robert and I had just finished lunch at a friend's house, a small gathering with neighbors who had become dear to us over the years. The weather had been kind that day, the sun filtering through the clouds, and there was a light breeze in the air. It felt like everything was just as it should be. Our children were far from us now, David, busy at the store, and Linda in St. Louis with her new family, but for that brief moment, it was just Robert and me, together, enjoying the comfort of each other's company. We were driving home, making our way along the winding highway between Springfield and Branson, when everything changed. The rain started suddenly, without warning. The sky, which had been clear just moments before, turned dark and heavy with the weight of the storm. The road, slick and treacherous from the downpour, became a blur in the rain-soaked air. We weren't going fast, just enough to be safe, or so we thought. But fate had a different plan. In an instant, it all fell apart. A truck, seemingly out of nowhere, lost control on the wet curve ahead of us. The next thing I remember is the deafening sound of metal crashing against metal, followed by an explosion of glass. There was pain, sharp, sudden, and all-encompassing. My body was thrown forward, the force of the impact leaving me disoriented and unable to move. The world around me spun in chaotic fragments, the rain still pelting against the windshield, the smell of burning rubber mixing with the thick scent of fear. Robert. My dear Robert. I remember his voice calling out to me in the haze, but it wasn't real. It was a dream, a nightmare that I couldn't wake from. My vision blurred, and for what seemed like an eternity, I couldn't hear anything except the pounding of my heart in my ears. The next few moments were a blur. Someone was shouting, someone was pulling me out of the car, but I couldn't make sense of it all. I could barely feel my limbs, and I knew that something was terribly wrong. The ambulance ride felt like it took forever. The sirens screamed in my ears, and the pain in my back, my legs, was unbearable. But it was the silence that terrified me most. The silence that came from Robert, his voice, which had always been there, was gone. There was only a quiet that hung in the air, thick with something I could not yet understand. It was only later, when I was conscious enough to grasp the gravity of the situation, that I understood. Robert was gone. The accident that day took my husband from me in an instant. He died on impact. It was as if the life I had spent so many years building had been wiped away in a flash. The world that had been full of warmth, of shared dreams and aspirations, suddenly seemed hollow and cold. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I couldn't process the enormity of it all. How could this happen? How could Robert, the man who had been my partner in everything, the man I had spent half my life with, be gone? I spent 3 months in the regional hospital, and those months felt like a lifetime. They were filled with surgeries and long days spent in pain and confusion. My body had been shattered in the accident, my spine severely damaged, leaving me paralyzed from the waist down. I could no longer walk, no longer take care of myself in the way I once had. The doctors were clear about my prognosis. I would never walk again. That realization hit me harder than the physical pain. My independence, the thing I had always prided myself on, was gone. As I lay in that sterile hospital bed, I felt like I was losing myself. I couldn't hold on to the life I had once known. The grief of losing Robert was unbearable, and now this new reality, being trapped in a body that no longer functioned the way it should, felt like a cruel punishment. I had lost my husband, and now I was losing the very essence of who I had been. David, our son, was 38 at the time. He had always been ambitious, always had his eye on the future, and I never imagined that the boy I had raised with so much love would become the person who would ultimately be in charge of caring for me. At first, David stepped in without hesitation. He was attentive and patient, hiring a young woman to help me during the day while he managed the store. It seemed like he was doing everything he could to make sure I had what I needed. I was grateful for his efforts, but at the same time, I was overwhelmed. I could barely care for myself, and now David had to carry the burden of both running the business and taking care of me. There was no denying that the situation was difficult, for both of us. But what I didn't see, what I couldn't see at the time, was the change that was slowly taking place within David. The responsibility of caring for me, of running the business, seemed to weigh heavily on him. The cheerful, energetic boy I had raised started to withdraw. The light in his eyes dimmed, and a coldness began to settle in. He became more distant, more silent, and the house we had once filled with love began to feel empty. I tried not to let it bother me. I was grateful that David was there. After all, he was my son, and he was doing his best, wasn't he? But it wasn't long before I noticed something more disturbing. David was changing. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I felt it in the way he spoke to me, in the way he handled my finances, in the way he dismissed my concerns. Something wasn't right, and deep down I knew it. Linda, my daughter, would visit whenever she could. She had her own life in St. Louis, her own family, but she always made time to come to Springfield to see me. She was my rock, the one person I could count on to lift my spirits. But she lived far away, and as time went on, I began to feel more and more isolated. I couldn't bring myself to burden her with the reality of what was happening at home. I didn't want her to worry. But David's behavior continued to shift. It was subtle at first, little things, like the way he talked about money, about the store, about my disability checks. The tension between us grew, but I didn't know how to confront it. I didn't want to believe that my own son, the boy I had raised, could be capable of what I was beginning to fear. In the months that followed, I realized that the situation was worse than I could have ever imagined. David wasn't just taking care of me, he was taking control. The more I tried to assert my independence, the more he shut me out. He began to make decisions without consulting me, dismissing my thoughts as irrelevant. I wasn't allowed to speak to Linda about the situation anymore. The calls I made to her were monitored. The food I was given became more sparse, more unappetizing. My medication was delayed or forgotten altogether. I started to feel like a burden, like I was in his way. The worst part of it all was that David wasn't just neglecting me, he was emotionally abandoning me. I had spent my whole life teaching him the value of hard work, of family, of love. But now, that same son, the one I had raised with everything I had, was slowly turning his back on me. I was no longer his mother in his eyes. I was an obstacle, a problem he didn't want to deal with. The turning point came when I discovered, by accident, that the grocery store, the very business Robert and I had built together, had been sold. I found the paperwork in the living room one evening, and my heart sank as I saw the figure on the sale receipt. David had sold the store without consulting me, without even telling me what he was doing. The power of attorney that I had signed, in my ignorance and trust, had given him the legal right to make that decision. But it was more than just the store, it was the money, the legacy we had worked so hard to build. I confronted David, and that was when the truth hit me like a slap to the face. He told me, with coldness in his voice, that I had nothing left. That the store was his now, and the money from the sale was his to do with as he pleased. My Social Security checks were barely enough to cover my medications, he said, and if it wasn't for him, I would be in a nursing home somewhere, forgotten. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How had my own son come to this? How had I missed the signs? The betrayal ran deeper than I could have ever imagined. The next few years would be the hardest of my life. But they also marked the beginning of a journey that would eventually lead to my escape, to my freedom, and to the discovery of what real love and family meant. But for now, I was trapped, in both body and spirit. The first few months after the accident were a blur of hospital rooms, surgeries, and painful therapy sessions. But what I remember most from those days wasn't the pain in my body, though it was constant, it was the quiet, creeping feeling of betrayal. I had always believed that my son David would be there for me, that he would care for me the way Robert and I had cared for him and Linda. I had never imagined that the very person I trusted most, the one who had once looked at me with the eyes of a child who sought love and guidance, would become the one to take everything from me. When I first came home from the hospital, still unable to walk, David was there, and for a while, he seemed to be doing everything right. He hired a young woman to help me during the day while he worked at the store, and at first, I didn't think much of it. I was grateful for the help, as I was still learning how to live in this new body, still trying to figure out how to do the simplest of things. I was so focused on my own recovery, on trying to regain some sense of normalcy, that I didn't notice the subtle shift in David's behavior. It was small things at first. He seemed to be losing his patience more often, his voice growing more strained when I asked for something. The woman he hired to help me, Jessica, wasn't very kind. She never seemed to take my needs seriously. She was rude, dismissive even, and when I mentioned my discomfort, David brushed it off. "She's doing the best she can, Mom," he would say, his voice tinged with irritation. I tried to tell myself that it was just the stress of everything, that David was under a lot of pressure, between managing the store and caring for me. But soon, I began to notice more. There was less food in the house. The meals that were once plentiful, simple but nutritious, prepared with care, became fewer and fewer. The fresh vegetables from the garden that my mother had lovingly planted were left to wither, and the canned goods I had always relied on were often past their expiration dates. My medications, which I depended on to control my blood pressure and manage the chronic pain from my back injury, were often delayed or simply forgotten. At first, I thought David was just overwhelmed. He had always been so focused on the future, on growing the business, and I knew he had a lot on his plate. But I couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease that lingered in my chest. The worst part of it was the way he began to talk to me. It wasn't the sweet, respectful way he had when I had raised him. It was more like he saw me as a burden, as someone who had become an inconvenience to his life. "Mom, don't you think it's time to stop being so dependent?" he said one evening, his words cutting through me like a knife. "You can't keep asking for help with everything. You need to be more self-sufficient." I was stunned. I had always tried to be strong, to take care of myself. But now, trapped in this wheelchair, dependent on others for the simplest tasks, I realized just how much I had lost. I never imagined that my son, who I had given everything to, would turn on me in this way. The most crushing blow came one evening, when I asked him about my Social Security check. The check that was supposed to cover my basic needs, my medication, food, and other expenses, had been late for a few months in a row, and I was starting to worry. "I need to know where my money is going, David. The check hasn't been enough to cover everything lately, and I can't keep living like this," I said, my voice trembling. His response was sharp and cold. "That pittance barely covers your medications, Mom. You think I'm rolling in money? I'm the one who's been paying for everything. You don't have any idea how much I've been doing for you," he snapped. I recoiled at his tone. This wasn't the son I had raised. The David I knew had been kind, considerate, and full of love. But now he was a stranger to me, a stranger who was angry, resentful, and dismissive of my needs. The situation only worsened over time. My disability checks were siphoned off into accounts I had no access to, and I started to feel more and more like I was being kept in the dark about everything. David became increasingly controlling, making decisions for me without consulting me, dismissing my concerns as irrelevant. He would tell me that he was doing everything for me, that I should be grateful for his care. But I didn't feel cared for. I felt trapped, isolated, and alone. I began to notice that even the smallest decisions were being taken away from me. My clothes, which had always been neatly laundered, began to pile up. The house, once a sanctuary, became more and more neglected. The garden, my mother's garden, began to die, just like everything else in my life. I had always tended to it with love, but now it felt as though everything I had cherished was slipping away, piece by piece. I felt powerless. I was trapped in a body that no longer worked the way it once did, and now I was trapped in a home that was no longer mine. I couldn't leave the house on my own. I couldn't even get to the front door without someone's help. I began to understand that I wasn't just physically confined to my wheelchair. I was emotionally confined as well. I was at the mercy of my son, the one person I had trusted with everything. And he had turned against me. There were moments when I considered speaking to Linda, telling her what was happening. But each time I hesitated. David had been careful to control the flow of communication between us. He would tell me that Linda had her own life, that I shouldn't burden her with my problems. He told me that I was being paranoid, that I was imagining things. And when I would try to speak up, he would be there, standing in the background, silently watching, ready to silence me. There was one moment, though, when I almost found the courage to reach out. I was on the phone with Linda, trying to explain the situation, but David was listening in. I had hoped to speak in private, but as soon as I mentioned what was going on, David walked into the room, his presence suffocating. "Mom, what are you doing?" he demanded, his voice harsh. "This is why we can't have a normal conversation. You're always making things up." I couldn't bring myself to continue the conversation. His words stung, and I hung up, feeling more isolated than ever. I had no one to turn to, no one who could see what was really happening behind closed doors. And so, I spent the next several months in this torturous limbo, unable to speak out, unable to escape. It was like living in a prison of my own making. My body was weak, my mind exhausted, and my spirit was breaking. The man I had raised, the boy I had loved so deeply, had become my captor. The worst part of it all was the isolation. I wasn't just physically confined, I was emotionally abandoned as well. My son had closed the door to the world, and I was left alone, not just in my wheelchair, but in my pain. The loneliness ate at me, gnawed at my soul, and I began to wonder if I would ever escape the life that had become my prison. But I didn't know yet that the end of this nightmare was coming. It would come not from David, not from the son I had raised, but from a stranger, someone who would notice the signs of my suffering and help me find a way out. It wasn't until one fateful evening in March 2009 that I finally reached my breaking point, though I didn't know it at the time. I had spent months in that suffocating house, imprisoned by my own son's cruelty, watching the days slip by, each one more painful than the last. The neglect, the isolation, the coldness, it all started to blur together until I felt like I was drowning in it. I couldn't escape the body that no longer worked, and now I couldn't escape the life I had been forced into. The house that had once been full of love, laughter, and the promise of a future had turned into a cold, empty shell. It was now a place where I was ignored, my needs dismissed as unimportant. I spent most of my days confined to my room, my once vibrant garden withering away outside the window. The wheelchair, which had once been a symbol of independence, had become my prison. Every day, I had to rely on David or Jessica for the most basic tasks, getting food, using the bathroom, even taking a bath. My dignity, my independence, had been stripped away, and I felt more like a burden than a mother. In those long, lonely days, I thought about giving up. There were moments when I thought it would be easier to just fade away, to escape the pain that had become a constant companion. The humiliation of being treated like I didn't matter was unbearable. But there was something deep within me, a small, stubborn flicker of hope, that refused to let me give in completely. I kept thinking of my daughter, Linda, and my grandchildren, Sarah and Michael. They were far away, yes, but I couldn't let them believe that I was gone. Not yet. Not like this. The turning point came when Linda decided, after weeks of failed phone calls, that she could no longer stand to be apart from me. She had been trying to reach me, but David had always been there, controlling the calls, shutting her out. He told her I wasn't well enough to talk or that I needed rest, but Linda was persistent. She couldn't ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. I'm not sure if it was her mother's intuition or something deeper, but one day, she made a decision. Linda packed up her things and made the long drive from St. Louis to Springfield, determined to see me with her own eyes. She didn't tell David she was coming. When she arrived at the house that March afternoon, I had no idea what was happening. I was in my room, the door closed, as usual, feeling the weight of the world on my shoulders. I was used to being alone, to the silence that stretched endlessly through the house, and I had no idea that Linda was coming. I heard the sound of the doorbell, a noise that hadn't been heard in months. It was strange, almost foreign, and I felt a sudden sense of hope that I couldn't explain. I wheeled myself slowly toward the door, my heart racing as I wondered who it could be. I didn't expect to see her, my daughter, the one person who had always been my rock, my support. But there she was, standing in front of me, her face full of concern and love. "Mom, oh my God, what have they done to you?" she whispered, her voice breaking as she took in my condition. I had lost so much weight, my clothes hung loosely on me, and I looked like a shell of the woman I used to be. The bedsores on my back had grown worse, and I was so weak that I could barely sit up on my own. Linda didn't wait for me to say anything. She rushed to my side, holding me, hugging me as though she could shield me from everything that had happened. She cried, and I cried with her. For the first time in months, I felt the warmth of someone who cared for me, who wasn't there to control me or manipulate me. Linda was there to rescue me, to bring me back to life. "Mom, I'm not leaving you here," she said firmly. "We're getting you out of this house. We're going to make sure you're safe." But as soon as she spoke those words, I saw the tension in David's eyes. He had been sitting in the living room, probably waiting for Linda to leave, but when he saw her walking toward me, he stood up quickly, his face hardening. "What's going on here?" he demanded. "What are you doing, Linda?" "I'm taking Mom with me," Linda said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm taking her out of here, David. This ends today." David's face twisted in anger, and I could see the familiar coldness in his eyes. It was as though the son I had raised, the boy I had loved, was completely gone. In his place stood a man who was willing to go to any lengths to control me, to keep me locked in this nightmare. "You don't know what you're talking about," he spat. "You think you can just waltz in here and take her away? She's fine, she's been well taken care of." Linda didn't back down. She wasn't afraid of him. "Mom's not fine, David. And you know it. I've seen the evidence. I'm calling the police." David's face turned pale as the reality of the situation hit him. He knew that Linda wasn't backing down, and he knew that his actions were about to be exposed. It was a threat, one that he couldn't deny. In that moment, I knew that Linda wasn't just going to rescue me physically, she was going to give me back my dignity, my voice. She wasn't going to let me be silenced by David any longer. As Linda made the call to the police, I felt a surge of emotions that I hadn't felt in a long time: fear, relief, anger, and above all, a sense of freedom that I had never known before. The police arrived within minutes, their presence a stark reminder that everything was about to change. David tried to explain, tried to deny everything, but the officers weren't fooled. They asked the right questions, took the right notes, and documented everything that had happened. The evidence was clear: the neglect, the emotional abuse, the physical mistreatment, and it was all right there, in front of them. As they spoke with David, I sat there, in my wheelchair, finally feeling like I had a chance. The police officer, Officer Sullivan, came over to me and asked if I wanted to speak with her privately. It was the first time in months that anyone had treated me like I mattered, that I wasn't just a burden to be ignored. "You're safe now," Officer Sullivan assured me. "We'll make sure you're taken care of. We're going to investigate what's been happening here." The weight that had settled in my chest for so long began to lift. I was no longer alone. I was no longer trapped. Linda stayed by my side, and together, we worked through the next steps. The process was long, and it wasn't without its challenges, but for the first time in a long while I felt hope. David was arrested that day. The charges against him were clear: financial abuse, neglect, and emotional mistreatment. He was taken into custody, and though I had mixed emotions about seeing my son in that position, I knew it was necessary. The protective order that was placed on him ensured that he couldn't come near me again. It was a painful process, but it was the beginning of my freedom. Linda took me straight to the hospital, where I was admitted immediately. I was malnourished, dehydrated, and covered in infected bedsores. The doctor couldn't believe I had lasted as long as I had. But I was alive, and that was what mattered. For the first time in months, I was no longer just a victim. I was a survivor. The hospital room felt different from any I had been in before. There was no coldness in the air, no sterile loneliness. The smell of antiseptic was replaced by the faint scent of flowers that Linda had brought in to brighten the room. The sun, which had so often seemed distant, now peeked through the blinds, casting a warm, golden glow across my face. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to feel something other than pain, fear, and shame. I let myself feel hope. I spent 3 weeks in the hospital after my rescue, undergoing intensive treatment. The doctors and nurses were kind, efficient, and patient with me. They treated me like a person, not a burden, and it was something I hadn't experienced in years. Every day, I could feel my body getting stronger, though the road to full recovery was long. The bedsores on my back began to heal slowly, and the malnutrition and dehydration I had endured began to fade as I regained strength. It wasn't easy. My body was weak, fragile, but I was alive, and that was what mattered most. Linda stayed by my side the entire time. She never left me alone, not for a moment. She sat with me, talking to me, making sure I was comfortable. At night, she would curl up in the chair beside my bed, exhausted from the emotional toll of what she had witnessed. I could see the weight of it all in her eyes, the pain of knowing what I had gone through and the guilt of not realizing it sooner. But there was also a quiet strength in her, a determination to make sure I was okay. And I knew deep down that I was finally going to be okay. At the hospital, I met with a social worker who helped me understand the steps we needed to take moving forward. The criminal case against David was already in motion, and Linda had hired a lawyer, Mr. Edwards, who specialized in elder rights. He was a gentle man, his demeanor calm but firm, and he explained the process in a way that made me feel empowered. We were going to undo the damage that had been done, reclaim my life, and make sure that David faced the consequences of his actions. As the days passed, I began to feel a sense of renewal. I started to take small steps forward, physically, emotionally, and mentally. I began to trust again, something I hadn't done in so long. Linda was my anchor, and so was Sarah, my granddaughter. She was 16 at the time, and she came to visit me every day after school. Her laughter, her energy, reminded me that there was still joy in the world, despite everything I had gone through. She brought me drawings she had made, little notes of encouragement, and every time she smiled at me, I felt a little bit stronger. The turning point came when I was finally discharged from the hospital. Linda and Jerome had made arrangements for me to stay with them in St. Louis temporarily while we figured out what to do next. It was a quiet, peaceful place, and for the first time in a long while I felt safe. The weight of the past few years, the constant fear and isolation, began to lift. It wasn't a cure for everything I had endured, but it was a start. At Linda's apartment, I found a new rhythm. It was different, so different from what I had known before, but there was a sense of freedom that I hadn't felt in years. I could get up in the morning, have breakfast, and sit outside in the sun without fear of being watched or controlled. It was strange, at first, to realize that I was no longer a prisoner in my own home, but soon, the changes became my new normal. The caregivers who came to help me with my personal care and mobility allowed me to regain some independence. The physical therapy sessions were challenging, but they reminded me that even in my weakened state, I had a part to play in my own healing. As I regained my strength, I also began to think about my future. I couldn't go back to the way things were, nor did I want to. I had lived through something that had broken me, but in the process, it had also made me stronger. I had been given a second chance, a chance to redefine my life, and I wasn't about to waste it. Linda and I spent a lot of time talking during those first few months. She helped me process everything I had been through, and she listened patiently as I poured out the pain and anger that had built up inside of me for so long. There were moments when the emotions became overwhelming, but Linda was always there, offering her love and support. Together, we made plans for the future. In the weeks that followed, I started to think about how I could use my experience to help others. I had learned so much, not just about the cruelty of abuse, but about the power of kindness, about the importance of speaking up and seeking help when you need it. Linda and I decided to start a support group for elderly people who had experienced abuse. We reached out to other families in the area, and soon, we were meeting regularly to offer support, share stories, and raise awareness about elder abuse. It became my mission to help others who had been through what I had experienced, and in doing so, I found a sense of purpose that I hadn't known in years. As time went on, I realized that this new chapter in my life wasn't just about surviving, it was about thriving. I wasn't just recovering from the trauma of my past, I was building something new, something meaningful. I found strength in the support of my family, in the love of my daughter and granddaughter, and in the work I was doing with others in my community. I had learned to crochet during my time in the wheelchair, and it had become both a form of therapy and a small source of income. With Sarah's help, I started selling my crocheted blankets, scarves, and baby clothes online. It wasn't much, but it gave me a sense of independence and accomplishment that I hadn't known in years. The physical scars I carried from the accident, from the neglect, would always be there. My body was no longer the same, but my spirit, my heart, had healed in ways I hadn't thought possible. I had been through the worst, but I had come out the other side, stronger and more determined to live a life full of purpose and love. The trauma of the past had shaped me, but it didn't define me. In 2010, after a year of rebuilding my life, I received an unexpected tribute. The City Council of Springfield honored me for my work with the support group, and for the first time in a long while, I felt recognized, seen, and appreciated. It was a moment of affirmation, a moment that reminded me that even in my darkest days, I had made a difference. I returned to Springfield to live in a new, adapted home, one that Linda and Jerome had helped me purchase, with some of the money recovered from the sale of the store. It was a modest home, but it was mine, and it was a fresh start. The neighbors, who had once turned away, now welcomed me with open arms, and I found peace in the quiet rhythm of my new life. Sarah, who had been so inspired by my journey, decided to pursue a career in nursing. She wanted to help others like me, to give them the voice and the care that they deserved. It filled me with pride to see her so determined, and it reminded me that the love we share as a family transcends everything. The pain, the betrayal, it all faded when I looked at her and saw the bright future she was building, the woman she was becoming. Now, at 78, I look back on my life with a sense of gratitude. I am no longer defined by the abuse or the betrayal I suffered. I am defined by my resilience, my love for my family, and my commitment to helping others. Every day is a gift, and I cherish the moments, both big and small, that make life worth living. My journey isn't over. There are still challenges ahead, but I know now that I can face them. No matter what happens, I will always be stronger than I was before. As I sit here, on the porch of my new home, watching the sun set on another day, I realize that the greatest gift I could give myself was the gift of freedom, freedom from the past, freedom from the pain, and freedom to live the life I deserve. It's never too late to start over, to find a new purpose, to reclaim your life. And I want everyone who hears my story to know that, no matter how dark the road may seem, there is always light at the end. Thank you for staying with me, for listening, for walking this difficult, yet meaningful road by my side. There are stories we carry with us, quietly, like old quilts, stitched together by the passing years. Each patch tells a tale, some joyful, others heavy with pain. I've carried mine for so long, tucked away in the folds of my heart. But I find now, at this stage of my life, that the time has come to let the quilt unfold and share the stories it holds. I never spoke of this before, not in the way I am now. You see, sometimes we hide our scars, thinking they're too deep to show, too painful to share. But I've learned, in my old age, that the scars are not the burden, they are the testament. They are the evidence of surviving storms, of blooming despite the drought, of being broken and yet, somehow, becoming whole again. For years, I believed silence was my shelter, but now I see that speaking is what brings freedom. We give the weight of our pain to the wind when we speak it aloud, and we allow others to find strength in our shared journeys. I tell this story now because I know there are others like me, others who feel the suffocating grip of neglect, of betrayal, of being lost in the shadows of someone else's choices. If you're watching this, and you feel alone in your struggle, I want you to know you are not. You are not broken beyond repair. You are not forgotten. It's never too late to find your voice, to reclaim your life, to rise again. In my life, I've seen seasons turn. I've seen winters that seemed endless, but each one eventually gave way to spring. The warmth always comes back, no matter how long the cold lasts. I hope that, if nothing else, this story can be a seed, a small, humble seed of hope in someone else's heart. You may feel buried, but I promise you, beneath the soil, you are growing. I see you. And I am here to tell you that one day, you will bloom again. I'm not the same woman I was before. The journey has transformed me, and I have learned to let go of the bitterness, the resentment. I've learned that our past, though it shapes us, does not define us. The love we give, the strength we find, and the grace we offer ourselves, that is the legacy we leave behind. I have lived long enough to see how the world spins, how it gives and takes, and how we can always rise, no matter how many times we've been knocked down. If you have learned anything from me today, let it be this: there is power in surviving, and there is even greater power in thriving afterward. If this story has touched you, if it has sparked something within you, if you, too, are starting to find your way to freedom, please take a moment to share your thoughts, to like, or to subscribe. Your voice matters, and your story is important, too. We are all part of this tapestry, and the more of us who speak, the more our stories can heal the world around us. And so, I leave you now with a simple thought, one that has come to define this new chapter of my life. Life, like a garden, needs time to heal, to grow, and to find its way back to the light. No matter how hard the storms may come, the sun will shine again. I am Martha Wilson, and today, I am reborn. If this story reached you in any way, please like this video and share it with someone who might need it. Subscribe to this channel for more real stories of survival, strength, and grace. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Because when we speak, even in whispers, the world begins to listen. God bless you. And thank you for listening to mine. Take care of yourselves, my dear friends. And may the peace I have found in this second spring find its way into your heart as well. Good night, and may your journey be one of healing, light, and the gentle unfolding of what is yet to come.